Yo, what's good? My name's Kang like Kangaroo. I'm a Canadian that's currently living and working in Seattle as a software engineer. And in this video, I'm going to be giving you 5 tips to keep in mind once you get your TN visa. Tip number 1 has all to do with border crossing. Always check your I-94 after you cross the border or a port of entry. The I-94 is an electronic record of whenever you enter the US. The border agent's going to fill this out for you whether you're entering through a land border or you're flying through one of the Canadian international airports that has US pre-clearance, or if you're flying internationally, for example, from Portugal to New York. Now, it's important to make sure that your I-94 is correct. On top of it being good to, just keep a record of, when you go into the US, etc. It's really important for all things immigration. If you're switching jobs, they're going to need your I-94. Or if you're getting a new TN visa, you're going to need I-94. Or if you're applying for green card, you're going to need a proper I-94. Now, it's important to check as soon as you cross the border because border agents can make mistakes. They're humans. Everyone makes mistakes. But it's a super huge pain to get it corrected. So you might as well make sure that they get it right on the first time. So what I normally do is when I go to the border, I'm like, hey, here's my passport. I'm here on a TN visa. And then they're going to ask me questions, whatever. And when they give me back my passport, and I make sure to ask them again, did you put my I-94 as a visitor's visa or on TN status? And then they'll be like, okay, yeah, we put you on TN. It's fine. And then after, I still go on my phone and I still make sure that the I-94 is uploaded correctly on the website. It's super easy to do. You just go enter some information and it will show you almost immediately. Another thing to bring with you when you cross the border each time is the I-797 form. So this form is an approval by the US Immigration that's basically saying, okay, we approved this guy to get his TN visa. You only get this form if your employer did a pre-approval for your TN visa. So if you went to the border with your own packet and then had to go to secondary inspection, you will not have this form. But if you do have it, make sure to bring it because it's going to clear up a lot of issues if there are any. When I flew back in from Thailand to Seattle, I was put in secondary interrogation for like 45 minutes because there were some visa stamp issues, and all of this would have been easily fixed had I had that form with me. So now I always travel with it. And the last bit of advice I have for border crossing is to get a Nexus card right now. Like literally stop this video, pause it, and go apply for Nexus. As someone who flies in between Canada and the US very often, the Nexus card, I cannot state how amazing it is. I don't have to wait in the customs security line like all those plebeians, and I'm able to breeze by security because it also gives you TSA pre-check. Now, tip number 2 is to take some time to understand the TN visa and understand what your goal is while living in the US. Now, one thing I think you should focus on is if you want your green card to be able to get your citizenship, or are you more so like, okay, I'm just going to work on the TN for a little bit and then go back to Canada, or are you somewhere in between? Now, I will say, if you're born in China, India, I would completely skip the green card, not even think about it, and just perpetually stay on TN as long as you want. Now, the reason I say that is that these countries are currently backlogged for the immigration process. I think they're like 10 years, like literally a decade before you get a spot in line to apply for your green card. And based off what I've read on the immigration forums, and I've been on a lot, the stress is really not worth the time or the effort, especially if you can keep perpetually getting TN visas. But assuming that you were born in a non-backlog country and you want to stay in the US long term, I think like 5-10 years plus, then I would consider getting the green card. It gives you a lot of options. It lets you work without any type of work sponsorship, so you can start your own business. You can have multiple jobs. I'm not saying you should, but I'm saying you could. You can sponsor your wife, your kids, and you have a clear path towards citizenship. Now, if none of those things really speak out to you personally, and I'm saying personally, I would completely skip the green card and just stay on the TN visa. Getting the green card is an added layer of stress that you're going to put on yourself, especially if you're only going to be working as a W-2 worker. And the green card itself has a bunch of downsides that not a lot of people talk about. So please let me know if you want me to make a video about this. I can talk about it in a future one. Now, of course, things change, things can happen, but having a plan and understanding what your options are can really help you in your decision-making process when those things do change. Now, the reason I think this part is so important is that I've been in the US for 2.5 years. And over these 2.5 years, the question of green card or no green card has been on my mind 24/7. It's been like mentally destroying me. Now, it's a pretty personal decision as to why this decision is so hard for me to make. But either way, I wish I was able to make this decision in like my first year and have it be done with and not have to think about it ever again. Now, tip number 3 is to get your money right. In comparison to Canada, the US monetary system is way more complex in terms of money, investment, and taxes. But I think the most important thing and the one that's going to have the most effect on your life and the most stress on your life is getting your taxes correct. Now, especially in the first year, I cannot recommend getting a cross-border account enough. When I moved to the US, I had to pay over $6,000 Canadian worth of taxes, and I also had a ton of mental headache, and I'm still dealing with that mental headache today. And all of this would have been avoided if I had talked to an accountant before I moved to the US. Now, here are some things that I would focus on learning about the monetary system while you're in the US. Number 1 is what to do with your Canadian investments. RRSPs are fine depending on what state you live in, but TFSAs, from my understanding, is a big no-no, and you're going to get taxed like out the wazoo if you have one of those. You will most likely have to file the FBAR on your American taxes every single year for all your Canadian investments and bank accounts if you choose to keep them. Now, all of these questions can be very easily answered if you talk to a cross-border accountant, so that's why I highly recommend them. Another tip that I would do is to really understand the US tax system. Now, as long as you're a W-2 employee and you're not doing anything super crazy with your taxes, I'm pretty sure after your first year, you can pretty confidently file your taxes with like TurboTax or Tax-Free USA. I would also really make an effort to understand the US investment accounts. Now, I think most people move to the US for A, better job opportunity, and B, for more money, because as we all know, the Canadian dollar is not doing the best right now. So while you're in the US, whether you're going to stay here or you're going to move back to Canada, it's in your best interest to really understand the investment system and make use of it while you live in the US and while you have that stronger US dollar. Now, for most people, the investment accounts that you're going to be dealing with is the 401k, which is very similar to the RRSP, the Roth IRA, which is very similar to the TFSA, and the FSA and the HSA, which are health accounts which don't really have a counterpart in Canada. For me personally, I max my 401k and my Roth IRA while contributing very little to those healthcare plans. And the reason is because I know I'm going to be retiring in Canada where we have free healthcare. Now, tip number 4 is to not get your H-1B. This might leave some of you confused or it might be a little bit controversial, but let me explain. Now, unless you are sure that you want to get your green card, I don't really see any value of getting the H-1B at all. For starters, there's a lottery system where they're only giving out like 65,000 H-1B visas a year. There's a time limit on the H-1B visa, which is like 6 years. And you can only work for jobs that specifically hire for the H-1B visa. The only real plus side for the H-1B visa is that it has dual intent and you can apply for your green card. On the flip side, TN visas are very easy to apply for versus the H-1B visa. All the employer really has to do for the TN visa is provide you a letter of support and their signature. And just as a side note, the TN visa is not technically a visa, it's a status, which is kind of confusing because everyone says TN visa, including me. But what that means is, and I think this is a little bit of a gray area, when you're applying for a job and it says, do you need visa sponsorship? I never check that because I only need you to sign me this letter. It's not actually a visa, it's a status. But anyways, the TN visa is infinitely renewable. There are no limits on how many TN visas can be produced, and there's no lottery system involved at all. And from my understanding, it's much easier to switch jobs on TN visas because the job that you're going to doesn't have to sponsor H-1Bs. They can just do another TN visa. But I'm not an employer, so I don't really know about that one for sure. Now, one major drawback for the TN visa is that it's not as common as the H-1B. So I think a lot of employers know about the H-1B, but not all of them necessarily know about the TN. But if you're working for a tech company, I think most of them know about the TN visas, and even the smaller startups are willing to work with you in order to get your TN visa. But either way, you might have to do a little bit of convincing, especially if it's a smaller company. And the other drawback for the TN visa is that there's no real clear path to green card. It is possible to go from TN visa to green card, but it is not common, and most employers prefer to go from TN to H-1B to then to green card. And another quick side note, the fastest way to get a green card based off my research is to literally get married. So if you're trying to get the green card, forget trying to get the H-1B and getting your work to sponsor you. Literally just focus on getting a husband, wife, or whatever that's a US citizen that will sponsor you. Now, tip number 5 is to have an emergency fund and an exit plan. The TN visa is a temporary visa that allows you to work for a specific employer. And over the past year, I think we've come to see how temporary the TN visa is to specific employers. With layoffs becoming very common now, I think it's important to A, have an exit plan, and B, have an emergency fund. Now, I think the advice for having an emergency fund is good for everybody, but I think it's especially important for TN visas who are temporary. If you get laid off from the TN visa, you have 60 days to find a new job or to leave the country. Now, as a temporary worker, I think it's important to have a larger than normal emergency fund in case you get laid off and have to move home, or if you have to buy plane tickets, or if you have to move to a different city. Now, along with all that money that you have saved in case you get laid off or in case an emergency happens, I think it's also important to understand what your plan is going to be. Now, personally, my exit plan is pretty straightforward. If I do get laid off, knock on wood that I do not, I'm simply going to hyper apply to jobs for the next 50 days. And if by the 50th day I do not have a job, I'm simply going to pack up all my stuff and ship it home and then ship myself to Southeast Asia for like 6 months. Now, I've been in the trenches for the past 2.5 years, learning everything I can about investments, immigration, and all things moving to the US as a Canadian on a TN visa. So if you have any questions, please feel free to leave them down below. I'm more than happy to help. That's why I'm making these videos. And if you have any video ideas, I will do them. So please let me know. And if you're currently in Canada watching this right now, you can click this video right here where I give you a detailed breakdown of all things you need to do before you move to the US.